Welcome and good afternoon. We would like to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for attending our K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Ariel and I'm the horticulture agent for K-State Research and Extension here in Shawnee County. This webinar series was founded out of a need to continue to provide extension education related to horticulture and gardening. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture education or a related discipline, but most of all, we each have a love for gardening in the natural environment. Each week, we'll have a new topic related to gardening. Our goal is to meet the needs of new gardeners as well as seasoned gardeners. You can find additional topics at our website, which Dennis has linked in the chat box. You can find upcoming topics on that website page as well, and then we also have our Facebook page, which we have also linked in the chat box. Please like and share these posts to help more people find out about this series, and use the hashtag K-State Garden Hours to help us promote it. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping notes. You may have noticed that you are unable to unmute your mic. We will keep these mics muted for the presentation just to help us eliminate some of that background noise. We also have a lot of participants today, which is wonderful, but to help us provide some of that bandwidth, we ask that you turn your cameras off during the presentation. As previously mentioned, we have a moderator today. Our moderator is Dennis Patton, who is the K-State Horticulture Extension Agent in Johnson County. If you have any questions throughout the presentation today, please use the chat box to send them. Dennis is going to be tracking these questions, and at the end of the presentation, as much time as we will have a Q&A session. We're going to do our best to get through all of the questions, but in the event that we do not answer your questions, we will upload a Q&A document on the K-State H&R website that we linked. So let's go ahead and get started. I know everyone is really excited to talk about our topic today, which is making and supporting pollinators in the garden. Jason Graves is our presenter. He is the Central Kansas District Horticulture Extension Agent, and we're going to explore who our pollinators are, understanding the pollinator needs, and then what we can do to support those pollinators in the garden. So if you'll give us just a few moments, we're going to go ahead and let Jason share his screen. Thank you.
Okay, how are we looking, Ariel? Things looking good now?
That's perfect.
Okay, excellent. All right, so as we normally do in any extension program, we just want to reiterate that we are, Kansas State University is an affirmative action equal opportunity employer, and we do not discriminate, and so we always make sure to mention that before we get started with any of our presentations. So that will be our first slide. I'm excited to be here with you guys to take a look at pollinators today, and that's a really hot and horticulture topic, I guess, around us, around literally everywhere that with the folks that I'm working with, and I'm sure you know, including our volunteers and constituents. And so we're gonna talk making and supporting pollinators today as our topic for the K-State Garden Hour. And honestly, there's not a more timely topic. I feel like, you know, with the awareness that's growing around biodiversity in our environment and ecosystem services. And so we're gonna take we're gonna try to get through a lot of very basic information. We're not gonna be able to go super in depth, but I do hope to really encourage you in your passion for creating pollinator habitat and understanding the needs of pollinators. And so we're going to jump in with my first slide, which is an interesting, maybe just tidbit of information about the note middle C, which is, you know, you think, what does that have to do with pollinators? But you see in the picture here a bumblebee that I took a snapshot of here just a week or two ago on some false indigo. And as any of you have studied bumblebees know how important they are, such an important pollinator, and they have this unusual ability to buzz pollinate. And I'm not going to go into in depth on what that means, but basically they can actually detach their wings when they're pollinating plants, and they make a buzzing sound, and the frequency is very close to the middle C note that you see here in the staff of music. And that vibration that they make actually significantly increases the release of pollen from a lot, excuse me, a lot of flowers, specifically tomatoes, peppers, blueberries. They're very important pollinators, a lot of food crops. And so this analogy here that you see in front of you is just a really great introduction for our topic today, because we're going to talk about how pollinators are truly a keystone species. They're really the center for a thriving and well-functioning ecosystem. And so really the survival of large numbers of other species depend on pollinators. And we're going to talk about how pollinators really are responsible for the reproductive cycles of up to, at least 75 to 80% of plants on planet Earth. And so the carrying capacity and biodiversity, and really, I like this analogy of the middle C. Pollinators kind of fit that criteria as being just right at the center of biodiversity and what we all are, as gardeners, are hoping to preserve and protect. And so why interest is growing. So let's, just a brief overview of why interest in pollinators is so high and continues to grow. And really, before we can talk specifics about pollinators, what I wanted to do is give a little higher view of why this is so important. Because honestly, we often can take small steps, but we want to have a full understanding of why we are interested in pollinators and ecosystem services. So we're going to do a brief overview of that before we jump into some specific topics as far as providing habitat and providing for the needs of pollinators in our gardens. So what we know is that there's less habitat for pollinators than ever before. And that's just, if you take a moment to think and look around you at how land use has changed over the last many decades and even beyond that, you'll know that we're experiencing a lot of fragmentation as urban development happens. We've also converted a lot of native land into agricultural uses. And so it's just good to be aware of the fact that one of the reasons interest continues to grow is because we're finally realizing that nature's not happy out there somewhere, as it's been said. Really, so much land has been developed, we have to take an interest in providing habitat for pollinators in our own gardens to ensure that biodiversity and ecosystem services continue. Going the wrong way here. Okay, so biodiversity, this is a term that is important for us to cover really quickly because it's one of those big words, scientific words, but it's a really important word. And we can define it as the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. And so when we're talking about pollinators, we're talking about, like we said, the keystone species that helps provide that biodiversity for us. And ecosystem services you see in this diagram are just some examples of the things that pollinators kind of fit right at the center of. Things such as our food, and then all the things that the plant world provides, such as fresh water, air quality regulation, climate regulation. The list goes on. And so if you look, take a brief look at that diagram, you'll see all the things that we as human beings are relying on as a species to live on planet Earth, and how it's really a community that is providing this for us, and pollinators and plants form kind of the basis for that system, the biodiversity and ecosystem services. And so we also know that biodiversity is highly connected to health. And so when we talk about pollinators, we're obviously not just talking about food, we're talking about health as well. And we need biodiversity for our own health and development. And what's a lot of folks have asked me about or noticed, in a lot of our cities and urban environments, is we've really moved to a more sterilized environment. And for our youngsters and the next generation that need to be exposed to nature, it's become difficult for us to find true nature experiences within even our cities and communities. And so we need to recapture that and reclaim that ability to interact with nature together. We know that a little bit of nature lowers our stress a lot, and it has really interesting effects on our health that studies have started to show over and over. We can't get into that right specifically now, but I do want to highlight that connection. So where does biodiversity come from? That's a huge question. And I've tried to kind of give you a hint on the screen here. As you can see, the answer is plants. Biodiversity, the variety of life, the carrying capacity of any space on planet Earth is determined by the variety and the diversity of plant life that it contains. And so when we're talking about biodiversity, we really start with plants. Plants are the foundation of that. And so as you all know, as gardeners, photosynthesis is a major miracle of life. It's the process by which we are able to consume and eat sunlight. Sunlight is converted into a form, trapped up in carbon bonds and sugars and carbohydrates, which can then be passed on into the food chain. So for gardeners, what's fun about this is we all love plants, right? And plants form the basis for biodiversity. And so this is something that we and pollinators agree on, right? Pollinators, we're going to see in just a moment, really require a diversity of plants to survive and thrive. And so as a community, that's just something to be aware of, that plants really determine the carrying capacity of how much life can be grown in any certain space, including the very backyards that we're working in. So we know from biodiversity studies that there's a lot of information and that has recently shown that biodiversity is suffering. And so when we think about biodiversity, we want to be aware two major groups that have been measured are birds and bumblebees. And I was just going to highlight those really quickly, just as, just an education for you. This study done in 2019 by Rosenberg sort of highlights the idea of declining bird populations. If you're interested, you can look that up. But it's pretty staggering numbers. And they found reported last year widespread population declines of birds over the past half century. Billions of birds have been lost, in other words. And as you look at the data that's been combined, you can see that the trajectory is not good. So it just provides us with an incentive as gardeners to turn that around. We can participate in doing something different. And really, that's something I think that helps us take that to heart. This is another study with Cameron, just documenting decline in bumblebees. And so a lot of our native bumblebees are in decline as well. And so if you're interested, you can certainly find a lot of information as you do research on the declines of these certain species. But honestly, you're going to see this in the media too. It's been interesting to see some of these, I've taken some screenshots over the last few years where we've, found these, the media with its, big headlines, talking about this topic as well. And so, we want to be cognizant. We don't want to be alarmist, but we want to be aware that there is a problem and we can participate in helping turn that around. So, here's I guess where we go today. The number one reason that, when I talk to a lot of gardeners, a lot of constituents that come to me with questions, the number one reason they're interested in a lot of the plants and things that we're talking about is because they are growing in their understanding of insects. And like I said, this is an important, we don't want to just rush over what an insect actually is before we talk about preserving pollinators. But So why interest in native and pollinator plants is growing, from what I'm finding, is that there is a growing understanding of insects with just even everyday gardeners that are really starting to pay attention. And even a lot of the landscape companies that I've worked with or talked to sort of express that same idea that, you know, the clientele even on that they touch and interact with kind of expect them to have some knowledge of pollinators and to really, you know, have an intention to protect pollinators as much as possible. So we want to talk about, you know, insects in general, and then we'll get specific with pollinators. Sort of the big idea that we're after today is that making insects, especially pollinators, is how we can participate in building biodiversity and sustaining those vital ecosystem services that we saw earlier in that chart, in that graphic. And, you know, the big idea is that insects are vital links to nearly all the food webs on the planet. And pollinators, what I like to say, play middle C. It's that idea, just like the bumblebee, they formed that middle sort of keystone species that is really important for us to protect if we value biodiversity and ecosystem services. So we want to talk really quick about what insects are and what it takes to make and support them. And that'll give us a good basis for looking at some pollinators. So what insects are? Simply, to me, they're the link to food. And that's one way to look at them. Insects pollinate our food, of course, but another important feature of insects is that they are also food themselves. And that's something that maybe we don't think about as much, but we look at the other animals and the communities and ecosystems that rely on insects. It becomes very interesting once gardeners realize the role that insects play in a truly well thriving and functioning ecosystem. And it has to do with what insects are. And so we call them the bridge, or, you know, you may have heard that description before, but the ecological importance of insects as sort of that bridge between the plants and the rest of the food chain is a very key part of a stable and resilient ecosystem. And when we talk about insects, we're talking about a group of animals that is most responsible for passing energy from plants to the animals that don't eat plants directly. And as you can see here in this picture, birds, you know, if you watch them very long, especially when they're raising their young, they're going to be consuming caterpillars and worms. They're going to be using these wonderful soft-bodied, protein-rich insects as part of their reproduction. And so really, when we talk about insects in general, we're talking about the key. Insects are the key to unlocking that stored plant energy. Caterpillars are a good example. This is an example I kind of found fascinating, but caterpillars grow so quickly. It was really interesting to do a little bit of research and realize just how quickly they actually grow. But if a human baby were to grow as fast as a caterpillar, it would weigh 8 tons at 10 days of age. And so that's a really interesting fact that just really highlighted to me how efficient insects are. They are the most specially equipped life form to be able to access the energy that's produced by plants. And so they excel at converting plant tissue into their body mass. And so it's no wonder why birds and other animals are eating insects. And a lot of places around the world, human beings are eating them as well. So that's just an interesting fact to consider when we talk about what insects do. And I like to ask the question, you know, when I work with various groups, is how do you react to insects? Do you react in horror when you see insects, you know, on a garden or tree? And, you know, hopefully as a result of some of this knowledge that's increasing and the awareness that's growing, we're less likely to do that. You can see here a checker spot caterpillar, very common on a lot of our summer flowers. And so these little guys can chew and chew and chew a lot of leaves, but you know, I've had sunflowers and different plants attacked by them, and you know, I didn't know. I mean, obviously there's some damage, but the butterfly is a beautiful butterfly, and so a lot of times if we can remember that nature as a whole is a community and we are a part of it, we're more likely to tolerate some of the things we see in our gardens, or maybe even find them fascinating and interesting. I think Pam mentioned this fact a couple weeks ago when we talked about native plants, but majority of insects are plant specific. And so she kind of highlighted that fact that insects have specific relationships with plants or plant families. Sometimes if we don't take time to think about it, we just assume insects are going to consume anything and everything. And that's not how it works due to the leaf chemistry and the defensive compounds that plants are made of. And so obviously it's important to remember that we have host plants and insects are specific for plants or plant families. And so when we remove a plant from an ecosystem, it's important to remember we've also removed or limited insects associated with that plant. And you can see here in these pictures, just a couple that I've snapped over the last couple years. Of course, our monarch caterpillar on some tropical milkweed, and then a red admiral caterpillar on nettle. And you know, these caterpillars don't interchange. These are the plants that I find them on every single year. And so it's important to recognize that there's relationships built over time between plants and insects. And so are we after less insects or more? Good question. Honestly, I think after most of us think about it, we realize we can tolerate a lot more insects than we think we can. And as we think through the relationships between the insects and the plants that they're on, we might even ask ourselves, you know, are there holes in the leaves and insects on those flowers? A question I like to ask is, has a plant that's fed nothing even done its job? And so we want to think through that and just be aware of how these complex and interactions are happening around us. It's a lot of fun as we learn and grow as gardeners in seeing and understanding and then participating in the community of nature that we're a part of. So I think we can all agree that insects, we're not looking which insects should we grow? And that's honestly the question that a lot of gardeners finally get around to asking after they've thought about, okay, and so insects aren't bad, are they? So there are a few, of course, insect pests, but the vast majority are wonderful. And so pollinators, as we said, becomes a keystone, is one of the keystone species of insects that we focus on, because without them, like we said, the survival of large number of other species would be in jeopardy. And so pollinators are, of course, any insect or animal for that matter that moves the pollen to the female part of the plant. So we're talking about, you know, there's many flower visitors that come to plants, but not necessarily, all of them are not necessarily classified as pollinators. But what we're talking about is any specifically insects that move that pollen to the female part of the plant. And so we've already said that pollinators pollinate not only food crops, but at least 80% of all plants on the planet. So we must make pollinators. Since they specifically play a role in that biodiversity, ecosystem services, and all the things that we previously discussed with the big picture of things. So with the big picture in mind, I think we're now in a little better place to really dive into a little more specific on pollinators. And we want to think, you know, who are our pollinators? And this list is not by any means, doesn't include everything that we could call pollinators, but I would say it's some of the most common Obviously, the European honeybee are native bees, butterflies, moths, flies. We're going to see beetles. There's other animals that do pollination services as well, but we zone in on sort of these ones that are really important. And you'll notice I've sort of highlighted the native bee line here because that's the one I find a lot of people are now learning about or more interested in as they embrace this, the pollinator friendly habitat. And so we're going to, you know, a lot of what we talk about going forward is going to be focused a little more on native bees. But honestly, these practices are going to benefit all pollinators. And so when we specifically talk about pollinators, bees are certainly the group that we are most interested in because bees are the only group that deliberately gather pollen to bring it back to their nests. And so it means that bees are very important pollinators because they actually are in the process, they gather that pollen for their reproduction. And so that's why we focus on them, and we're going to talk more about them as we go through this slide set. So I want to show you a few pictures here that I think are fun. I've been kind of snapping some photos here in my garden here the last week, just knowing I was going to present this. And as you can see here, there's it's just beautiful to see these native bees in action. I believe this is probably a sweat bee that I saw crawling over my herb garden this week. And you can see just how that pollen is sticking to that bee, and it's going to use that pollen to go back and reproduce. It's going to serve a lot of good use for that bee. To show you this one, this is actually not a bee. We mentioned flies as being important pollinators as well, but this is actually a hoverfly. This is a commonly seen fly that we'll find in pollinator gardens as well. There's a little bit of difference between the flies and the bees. The flies, you can identify those because they only have 2 wings. Bees have 4 wings, and the bees often have very short antennae, or I should say the flies actually have shorter antennae than the bees as well. So you'll see a hoverfly here, and it is a kind of a neat, it's fun to watch them fly because they just kind of, they get often misidentified as sweat bees, but they kind of hover in the air. The larva of the hoverfly is also very beneficial. And if you can see this picture that I took last year, it's a hoverfly larva. It's hard to see, but it's consuming an aphid. And so if you get to recognizing these, not only is the adult of some of these pollinators beneficial, obviously, but the larva is as well. So we want to learn to recognize those in our gardens as we work around with pollinators. Here's another interesting little stem boring native bee, a small carpenter bee. It's pretty fascinating. This is just on my greens, my mustard greens that I just let go to seed. They become a great pollinator resource. And so you'll see this little small carpenter bee will be boring into stems and nesting in my garden as a result of access to the food source that it has here, and nesting stems that I've got, whether it's elderberry or blackberry, different stems that are in the garden. You'll see another sweat bee here. This is a metallic looking sweat bee and a hoverfly on the same flower. And then the final picture from my photography this last week was this wool carder bee. And so another interesting native bee, or actually I should say this one's not native, it was introduced, but it's an interesting bee because it harvests has really sharp jaws and can harvest actually it can harvest the trichomes, or the little hairs off of plants, and it actually uses those in its nest. And so, you know, there's this really interesting interaction between us, our plants, and native bees that as we start to learn about them, we're going to be fascinated by, and we're going to be looking at some really unique things happening in our landscapes as we learn to make and support pollinators. So we need to understand pollinator needs. And obviously, for simplicity, I've just broken these down into 4 key things. Obviously, food. We understand generally that a diversity of plants, like we said, plants, think back to the previous slide, we talked about biodiversity. The amount of life any ecosystem can support is determined by the diversity of plants that are growing in it. Plants are the foundation. And so we need a lot of diversity of plants for our pollinators, preferably native, but it's not limited to just native plants. We need nesting and egg-laying sites, sheltered, undisturbed places for hibernating and overwintering. That sometimes is an overlooked thing that pollinators are in need of, and often we sort of overlook them when it comes that winter season where they need to hibernate and overwinter. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And they also need pesticide-free habitat, and so we want to be aware of ways in which we can designate areas of our landscape, or whether it's our pollinator garden, to be pesticide-free. So let's take a look at, I'm actually going to go to point number 2 first, which is nesting opportunities, because this one, a lot of times I find folks are interested in or want to learn more about. So understanding pollinator needs, we have separate types of nesters. We have ground nesting native bees, and we have stem nesting native bees, whether it be pithy or woody stems. And we really can enhance our native pollinator populations by providing nesting opportunities. I sort of like this graphic from the Oregon Bee Project that actually sort of highlights that just in a picture form. Where are the native bees, right? And so you can see we've got bees that are going to be in the ground nesting bees. We've got bees that are going to be in stumps and wood. We've got bees in stems. We've got bees in tree snags, or these various places in nature where they have learned to reproduce. And so think about that in terms of our own gardens, and I think we can find ways to adapt what we're doing to allow for these native pollinators to reproduce and the habitat that they need. So we'll start with ground nesters. Ground nesting bees are the most common as far as native bees go. And obviously they're, from what I have researched, about 70% of our native bee populations actually nest in the ground. And so it's important when we talk about these ground nesters to think about how that relates to our gardening practices. How many of us are able to leave patches of untreated, undisturbed earth in our garden, or do we even consider that fact? Typically, these kind of bees prefer a south, warmer facing slope with loose soil. And some of the practices, I'm not a big fan of landscape fabric anyway, but when you think about providing nesting habitat for ground nesting native bees, landscape fabric does not help them at all. And so that's, if you need another reason not to use landscape fabric, there you go, you're supporting these native bees. Even heavy layers of mulch can interfere with our native bees. And so even our mulching practices, we want to be aware of. If we're heavily mulching, all of our beds everywhere, that can interfere with these bees. And so, it's important that we consider the fact that some of these bees are utilizing the ground. And I think sometimes that's just something, as we become aware of it, we start watching what we're doing and looking down as we're in the garden to see if these things are around us. And so just be aware that there's a good majority, 70% of native bees, that do utilize the soil and excavate tunnels, some of them pretty deep, for their, they actually provision these cells in the ground where their young will be reproduced. And so we want to be aware of that. We also have pithy stem and woody nesters, and these would be, as you can see here, just some pictures that I found that I think highlight this really well. These bees are using stems. And so you can think of roses, goldenrod, elderberry, blackberry, some of our common plants that we grow in gardens that have more of a pithy or hollow stem. And they're going to be provisioning nests within these stems as they work. Typically one egg in a cell with a pollen bundle for that new developing larva that to develop with, and then as it matures, it will hatch out and out of that actual stem. And so this is another important thing for gardeners to be aware of, is that native bees not only are using the ground, but they're using our stems, the stems of our plants. And so I think that may help us think through maybe what types of things we might change with our maintenance practices even. The pithy stem and woody stem nesters, a good example of those is the leafcutter bee or the wool carder bee. And I just share these pictures as an example simply because if you've ever seen a leafcutter bee carving these little C shapes out of your leaves, you know, don't get alarmed by that. That's a beautiful interaction that you're having with pollinators in your garden, and those bees are using that to provision their nests. And so the wool carder bee is very similar in that it collects, like we said, the trichomes. It collects the hairs and different pieces off of these plants and uses those in its nest. And so a lot of our plants, we just need to learn to share, right? We as gardeners can share with pollinators, and we can actually assist and bolster their success. And so stem nesters, you know, kind of in summary, you know, we want to provide stems and snags, and we talked about just the idea with the maintenance. We want to, you know, avoid cleaning up too thoroughly. A lot of times what I found is gardeners throw away a lot of stems. They cut everything down at the end of the season, toss it out, and don't realize that they've probably just thrown away a lot of next year's native bees and butterflies. So we need to be creative about finding ways to leave pollinator habitat, whether it's cutting the stems down and leaving them, or bundling them and putting them in the back of the garden, or even installing a snag. And I've got a picture of that here. You know, who says that this can't be artistic as well? This is a snag in one of our local gardens, kind of an artistic old log. You know, it can be used in just an interesting way, not only to provide an artistic flair in a garden, but this can serve as great pollinator habitat for those woody nesting bees. And so you might consider ways in which you can provide stems and snags in your garden for these native pollinators. I want to say just a quick little bit about the nesting blocks as well. A lot of folks use these as habitat, which is great. The artificial nests will work. You want to be careful though, because some of the, you know, typically nests that are made out of 4x4 blocks can be a little bit too shallow. Mason bees specifically, in order to use these nests, they need deeper tunnels. And so you can see that the block here is deeper than just a 4x4 block that's commonly sold, you know, in a lot of stores, those sorts of things. Because the female mason bee often lays her male eggs first in the tunnel, and if the tunnel is too short, she'll never actually get to laying the female eggs. And so it's just a preventative, protective mechanism that those bees use, because the males are easier to produce, don't cost as much. And so if our nesting blocks, it's good to do a little research on your nesting blocks to make sure you're actually going to enable the bee to reproduce, because if the mason bees don't get to actually producing females, the cycle is broken. And so just an interesting thought on that. Do your research and learn about artificial nests. Artificial nests usually have to be replaced after 2 years as well, because typically we can run into problems with diseases and mites and things that can infest those. And so you want to be aware not to be leaving those out for long periods of time. The stem bundle idea here, you can see here in this picture as well, is just taking those stems that we've cut from the garden And instead of throwing those away, we're putting those back out as nesting habitat. And so you can do some looking into that as well. A lot of people build their own stem bundles out of various things, or use the stems they have available to them to support native bees. And so you can certainly do that in multiple ways. I want to say a little bit about bumblebees. Bumblebees often nest underground. They're kind of a little bit in between. They're actually a little more adaptable, which makes, should be encouraging to us as gardeners, because we can really support bumblebees. They're pretty flexible, honestly, in where they can nest. We just have to be aware of what they need. Bumblebees will nest underground or above ground in cavities. And so the key with the bumblebees is the overwintering habitat. And that's what a lot of folks aren't aware of, is that these bees have annual colonies. And so the queen bee overwinters. And if there is no place for that bee to overwinter in your landscape or garden, that population will not continue. And so I highly encourage you to do some research on bumblebees. And this idea of trying to sterilize everything is really damaging to bumblebees. We need areas that are untouched in the landscape to allow that female queen to find a place to overwinter in the landscape. And so also, they often get confused with carpenter bees. As you can see up here, carpenter bees are another wonderful pollinator, but they are not bumblebees. They have a much darker abdomen. And so they are actually wood nesters, whereas bumblebees are more, they're adaptable in the sense that they can find a lot of different places to build their hives. They are a social group as well, which is unique for our native pollinators, the bumblebees. So I'd encourage you to learn about bumblebees. You can look up the Xerces Society online. They have a nice little bumblebee conservation poster here that you can get, and it goes through some of that. There's also some lists of plants on the Xerces website, and I will have a list of links and resources that will be posted on after this talk with the recording. So encourage you to come back and check those links out. But this is just an idea where they've provided a list of plants blooming throughout the season for bumblebees. So the summary would be just to identify nesting sites and protect them, and to create new nesting sites. And with all this new knowledge of where these bees are existing, I think we'll all be equipped to do that, whether it be in the ground or in cavities, in stems or snags, those sorts of things. Even rock piles can be a great place for bumblebees. So we need nesting sites for our pollinators, and that's something a lot of our gardens may be able to improve upon. What else do you pollinators need? So let's finish up here with these three other key elements, which is just simply pollen and nectar all season. They also need water, and this propolis, which is an interesting new there's some research going into this that is interesting as far as what bumblebees are doing with plant oils and waxes and those sorts of things. And you can, these are basic things I think we all sort of know, but let's just breeze through them. Pollen and nectar all season, and that's key for our pollinators. And so, we want to be out evaluating our landscape for those floral resources and hoping to get diversity with our plantings so that we have things blooming all season long. An interesting fact about native bees is that the adults are active only 2 to 6 weeks. And so think about your landscape, and if you have a period of time where there's nothing blooming for even a couple weeks, that could actually disrupt a native bee life cycle. That may be the only time when that specific bee is out. So we want to be aware as we create our plantings for pollinators that we actually have a good amount of diversity in our plants, but also that our plants are blooming throughout the season. Purples and yellows tend to be pretty attractive to bees, reds not so much, but floral constancy is important as bees do prefer the masses of plants. And so it's much easier for honeybees and bees in general to work between similar flowers. And so, if we can put anywhere, typically a good mass, not just one or two plants, but we need to have masses of flowers in groups that they can work between because they are much more effective that way. So, just think through your plantings and maybe how you can encourage bees with the way you promote, the way you plant and the plants that you choose. Some bees are specialists, and so it's, one thing I always mention is just that there are a lot of generalist bees. Bumblebees are interesting because they're very generalist. They can pollinate a lot of plants, and so that's why it's great that we support and provide habitat for bumblebees. There are a lot of bees that are specialists that maybe only pollinate a few plants, and so that can be for a lot of reasons, but we're not going to talk about those specifically. But just to be aware of that, some bees do specialize highly on certain plants, and so it's important that we also take in mind some of the plants that might support some of the native bee specialists. And here you can see a list of a few of those: the sunflowers, asters, goldenrods, willows, black-eyed Susan. Some of our common native plants are really good for the native bee specialists, and so you can go back and look at Pam's talk. She included a lot of those in the native plant conversation as well. So Xerces also has a plant list at their website, so I encourage you to check that out. It's on my list of resources that you can look at as well. So the final piece I wanted to mention was propolis, which is an interesting area of research in regard to bees, honeybees and native bees. But bees are also using waxes, resins, and oils from our plants. And these things have antibiotic properties that prevent disease. And they use those in their hives and nests to ensure success in reproduction. And so we don't really know all the best plants, but I just thought this was really intriguing for us home gardeners, that this idea of self-medication in pollinators has become something interesting and being researched more and more. You can see here the sunflower is one of those flowers that we've identified that does provide a lot of self-medicating ability for many pollinators. This white turtlehead flower has been the subject of research as well. But it's interesting to know that the plants that we choose and having a diversity of plants actually will allow the bees to provision their nests with resins, waxes, and oils that are actually going to help them thrive as well. So I don't think too many gardeners will complain about that. We like to have a lot of different plants and blooms in our landscapes, and that is really the best for pollinators in every regard. So where do we go from here? And simply, I want to, close with this idea that every garden or park has a function. And really, in the past, gardens weren't necessarily designed to play an ecological role, but that's now changing with the awareness that's growing about pollinators and the habitats that they need to survive. And so planting for beauty is not going to be enough to maintain that biodiversity that we talked about earlier. We need a lot of biodiversity in our world because it really is the foundation for the ecosystem services that we are using each and every day of our lives. And so not only do gardens need to grow beauty, they've got to grow life. And so even modest increases in habitat in our landscapes and parks will significantly increase pollinator species richness around us. And I like this little study that was also done last year that highlights this idea that has revealed that pollinators can actually thrive in urban environments. And in fact, urban environments and cities, home gardens and landscapes may be really key to the future of pollinators with the land use changes that we talked about earlier. So I encourage you to do a little reading and to learn just about how possible it is in just our small backyards to actually really support a really rich number of pollinators. And, it just really is an encouraging, I guess, information for me in my gardening, just that I can participate in the ecosystem and building biodiversity just from a very small backyard. And so I encourage you to do better than this. And we know we can do better. And gardeners are are certainly becoming aware that, you know, a lawn is not a functioning ecosystem. This is not this is very little biodiversity here. And so we certainly can do better than this as we move forward. Many gardeners are going to prefer natives and non-natives, which can work very well together. There's a lot of flexibility here in how we support pollinators. But, you know, gardens with both natives and host plants that include other ornamentals for color and nectar can be the best of both worlds. We can have beautiful gardens that are amazing pollinator habitats. And so there's no reason that we can't, you know, participate in the community around, the nature community around us in our gardens at home. I do want to mention that there are certain food hubs, and just, you know, I've highlighted a few of these that have been identified as plants that a lot of pollinators, a lot of insects use generally. And so, you know, you might consider including what we might call food hubs in your gardening. A lot of our native plants, as you can see here, are on this list. We will also, you know, when we're talking about food hubs as far as trees, the oaks tend to rise to the list as well. And so if you have the opportunity to plant native oaks, you will, you know, that's another great way to support the biodiversity and habitat around us. So let's review. So this is going to be, you know, start here and start simple. So we talked about food. A diversity of plants are needed for our pollinators that bloom all season, and we've kind of covered that. Nesting and egg laying sites are important. We talked about the importance of the ground nesting bees, the stem nesting bees, snags, even artificial nests can be used to enhance nesting and egg laying sites. We need sheltered, undisturbed places for hibernation, specifically with bumblebees especially. So we want to be thinking through all these, you know, this sort of a checklist if we're talking about an effective pollinator garden. And then finally, that pesticide-free habitat is really important. There's a lot of complex interactions between pesticides and bees that are you know, to get into in this topic, but I have included a link with our resources that will be attached that takes you to a K-State publication by Dr. Raymond Cloyd that really thoroughly covers interactions between pesticides and bees. And so I'd encourage you to look at the resources that'll be attached with this, this topic as well. So start simple and expand over time. We're taught it's important to protect pollinators. You can start there by just learning and identifying habitat, tolerating a few more weeds, doing things that will enhance the pollinators around you that are fairly simple. A lot of these things don't require a lot of effort. There's even research coming out showing how detrimental artificial night lighting is to pollinators, especially moths. And so, you know, there's a lot of research and learning we can all do on practices that can help us just simply protect pollinators in our existing environments. But then beyond that, we can certainly start a pollinator victory garden, as I would like to maybe call it. But, you know, whether you start small or big, honestly, like we said, those spring, summer, and fall blooms are going to be very important as far as food sources, and we can continue to expand upon even a simple planting. And then I like the idea of protecting and enhancing nesting opportunities, and, you know, just being aware of what can you do to provide those snags, stumps, stems, and soil in your landscape for these bees. And I think if we can put the entire picture together, you know, we can be very successful, like we saw in our urban environments, in our city backyards, at growing and making pollinators, supporting this keystone species that is so important for all of us going forward. And so, you know, my final encouragement would be, you know, just how much life can you grow in your garden? And I issue that as kind of a challenge to us all. How much biodiversity and life can you support in the space that you manage? And that's an important question, and it starts honestly with pollinators as the keystone species. And so I want to wrap up with that, and I want to invite any last minute questions as we have time for those here. And we'll stop my screen sharing and we'll take any that we have. So.
Well, thank you, Jason. That was excellent. I especially really like the part where you said we all need to learn to share. I think that's a really good message for us, especially in the garden. I know we had a lot of great questions in the chat box that Dennis has been preparing. So Dennis, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, we have just a few minutes to go over questions.
Yes, I will do that. So let me just kind of maybe hit some of the high point questions. One was, when is it safe time to clean up the garden in the spring? So leaving, those snags, those type of things. So when do we start cleaning up that garden in the spring?
Oh, okay. Yeah, the cleanup. So it's, a lot of folks, if you're concerned about leaving stems up in the winter, you can cut those off and stack them in the back of the garden until, ideally, what I've read is until temperatures are consistently 50 degrees or higher is your goal, because a lot of those stem nesting bees will be coming out of those stems by that point. So, we don't necessarily have a target date as much as just saying, wait till those temperatures are about 50 degrees on average, and that's a good target.
Okay, next question of general interest, is there a good resource book for photos for the caterpillars and butterflies that we can take out in the garden to help us identify the good guys?
Well, there are a couple in my links that I'll have listed on my attachment to this. With this presentation, I'll have several links, and one of those is a book that the Xerces Society actually put out called Attracting Native Pollinators, and it is a great resource, has some pictures. They also have a lot of identification resources on their website. So there will be links in that, that PDF that I encourage people to check out.
Okay, back to the ground nesting bee, a couple questions came in. You talked about wood mulch. What about natural mulches like fallen leaves, garden debris? Are those beneficial, or are those still problematic?
I think they could potentially still be problematic if they are deep, if they're really have a lot of depth to them. Typically, a lot of our native bees are really looking for that bare soil. And so if you can create, in some of the studies I looked at, even the areas where they were finding native bees was in areas where they had treated with Roundup to clear the ground cover, and that's where the bees were coming in. So, I think if you can provide some bare ground, that's probably the ideal. A little light layer mulch probably isn't going to inhibit them too much. So,
okay. And Jason, I think you've already answered this one, but then the question was, if you wanted to do ground covers, would those interfere with ground nesting bees? I think you just answered that one, maybe.
Yeah. Ideally, we'd like some space, and this is another good reason just to get out and do a little weeding. I know none of us like to weed, but a little bit of bare ground between some of our flowers and plants that's left open the bees will get there. They'll find it. So, just a little weeding, good reason to weed the garden.
And Jason, following up to your 50-degree comment, is that daytime, nighttime temperature? Is that
yeah, that'd be daytime temperatures. Yeah.
Okay. And then what do you look for on those ground dwelling bees? You're looking for holes, loose fill. What's our key when we got a healthy habitat?
Yeah, honestly, you should see those holes in the ground, and if you're patient enough and can watch the holes, you'll see them come in and out. They move in and out of those holes kind of on a daily basis to provision those nests. And so if you start to see holes like that in a bare area, maybe just put a marker there and just, watch and see if you can see the bee. But yeah, there's, like I said, 70% of the native bees do this. And so that's from big to little to tiny. I mean, that's thousands of different bees that do that. So.
And maybe one quick one more here too. So obviously the vast majority of insects in the garden are beneficial insects or don't cause any harm, but what do we do with the problematic ones? For instance, grasshoppers. How do we get those under control without harming our natural healthy populations?
Yeah, it's a tough question. There's definitely a balance of some of the pests that can really cause us problems. And so we have to use as many alternatives as we can. I will try to include on my link resources, I think I have a link to some alternatives for pesticide use that I'd encourage people to look at. And honestly, I would, if you can, just keep your pollinator habitat separate as much as possible so that you can avoid all pesticides, ideally. But in the case that we can't, we have to just do it with extreme caution, and I will have resources for that, yeah.
And Jason, you keep referring to these resources that will be posted on the webpage that I've shared several times with the link.
Yes,
registered. Is
right.
that correct for everyone?
Yes, yep. It'll be on a PDF file where you can just click the link, yep.
Okay. And the last question before we wrap up is back to kind of the carpenter bees and some of the other wood boring ones that get into our home. How do we handle that without taking out the goods, since they're also pollinators?
Right, yeah, the carpenter bees is a good question. I have a love-hate relationship with them on my deck, honestly. And what I've started to do is try to provide snags. If you can provide, just take an old log or stump and drill some holes in it and put it out in the garden. I mean, if they can find a more appealing habitat, they're going to go to it. My deck is not the most appealing. So if you can create your own snag, that may be enough to do it. I mean, but experiment with different ideas, yeah.
And I think, Ariel, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I think that kind of gets through the vast majority of our questions that have been posted.
That's great, Dennis. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today. We have, as we've mentioned, more webinars coming up on Wednesdays. I'm actually teaching next week's webinar on indoor plants. Jason really set the bar high, so I need to go work on that right now. This session is going to be recorded. It'll be posted tomorrow afternoon at the website that Dennis has given us a couple of times. You're also going to get an email shortly with an evaluation survey. This is so important because this really shows our stakeholders that what we're spending this time on is valuable to you, our communities, and that we should continue to do that. So please take a couple of minutes to fill out that survey. I've also put an email address. If you have any other questions that we weren't able to get to today, please send an email to ksuemg@ksu.edu. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great day.